Coming up on this episode, the latest on Jonathan Kuminga's future with the Warriors and how it could lead to a potential reunion with former All-Star Andrew Wiggins. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope you're all having a good start to your week and enjoyed your weekend. I've just finished listening up to the latest Warriors Plus Minus podcast with Marcus Thompson and Anthony Slater of The Athletic, and of course, Tim Kawakami, formerly of The Athletic, now of the San Francisco Standard, I think he is. Very interesting podcast, obviously, so I thought I'd just jump on and share my quick thoughts and takeaways from that. Obviously, the main topic of conversation is Jonathan Kuminga. He is dominating headlines among the Warriors and the fan base at the moment. We know that as he prepares for restricted free agency. Probably the main quote that I want to take from this podcast episode came from Slater in regard to Kuminga and how his future and the futures of Kevin Durant and Giannis Antetokounmpo could be linked here heading into the offseason and could potentially, from my takeaway from this, it could prove problematic for Golden State. So Slater's quote was, "Miami, from what I gather, is a team that potentially would have some interest in Kuminga, but I think they're going to be kind of in the potential Giannis, Kevin Durant market. So theoretically, what happens there is a domino," Slater said. So this domino theory aspect to this is really interesting because, first of all, it kind of puts Kuminga on the back burner. In fact, it puts and this is not just a Kuminga thing, this is almost like league-wide, right? There are going to be so many players held up by what happens with KD and Giannis. Like, teams are going to, we know how many teams are going to be interested in Giannis. It's going to be basically the entire league. Even if there's only like 10 or 12 teams max who could actually theoretically get him and have the assets to be able to do so, right? So there's that. We know KD, yes, Phoenix didn't make the playoffs, but KD still put up some ridiculous numbers this season. The Warriors themselves have been linked to these guys. Like, they tried to trade for KD before they traded for Jimmy ultimately before the February midseason deadline. We know for years it's been reports that, Joe Lacob has a dream of pairing Giannis with Stephen Curry. So the Warriors themselves have been linked to these two players, and we know those two guys are going to dominate discussion among franchises and front offices and whatnot until those guys get sorted in their futures and where they're going to be. Again, Giannis, everyone's kind of waiting to see whether or not he actually wants to stay in Milwaukee or whether he's going to request a trade. We haven't really heard anything on either side of the spectrum yet as it pertains to that. So we're waiting on that. We're going to be waiting on to see, KD's in a situation where we feel like he's going to be traded or we feel like he's going to be on the market at least. But, Phoenix has still got to work out what's going on with their head coaching situation. There's still reports that, there's a chance KD could remain in Phoenix for the last year of his contract. I'd say that's unlikely, but we don't know. And so there's going to be so many players and teams really put on the back burner here as, the priorities lie with Kevin Durant and Giannis Antetokounmpo. And one of those is Jonathan Kuminga, and that creates a sticky situation for the Warriors where they're just having to wait this out, potentially, where you might get to the start of free agency, but if the KD Giannis stuff isn't fixed by that point, or we don't have a result on that by that point, then things might get pushed back, a week or two until these things play out. And I think the draft is where this becomes really important, because draft time is where we could see a blockbuster KD or Giannis trade, and then that gets figured out before free agency even starts. We know the Warriors, they traded Jordan Poole for Chris Paul. Again, not to the level of the KD Giannis potential trade, but they did trade Jordan Poole for Chris Paul on draft day going back 2 years ago. So that's probably the first avenue here once we get past the finals, which I might be back for another episode before the finals start on Thursday. Game 1 between the Thunder and Pacers should be a fantastic series, but I might get into that in the next 24, 48 hours or so, not on this episode. But once we get past that, get into the draft, that's where things could really start to heat up a little bit when it comes to KD and Giannis, and then hopefully getting a resolution on those things which allow other teams to potentially have interest in JK. Because the other thing here, and I think the bigger problem potentially for the Warriors and JK is that if a team like Miami, for example, come to the Warriors and say, well, we've got interest in Kuminga, but then they end up getting KD or Giannis and suddenly say, well, of course, we're out of the Giannis stakes now because we're out of the Kuminga stakes because we just got one of KD or Giannis. Then all of a sudden the market dries up a little bit. And from a JK standpoint, he can no longer, may no longer be able to get the $25 to $30+ million per year deal that he wants. The life-changing 4-year, $100+ million contract that really limits his ability to be able to do that. And then from a Warriors standpoint, obviously, if the market is more limited and not as strong, then what they can potentially get back in a sign and trade is going to be far less valuable than if the market was really strong and they had a bunch of different options on the table and a bunch of different teams that actually had interest in signing JK to a significant deal. So this is where it could become a real issue for both Kuminga and the Warriors. And as I spoke about on last episode and as Slater kind of reported about, last week, this is why it might be so problematic. It might be so difficult that Kuminga and the Warriors just have to say to each other, look, this is not necessarily what we absolutely want, but it's just too difficult to do anything else. So let's just get back together. Let's do a 4-year, $100 million contract, 4-year, $110 million contract, and we'll get back together. We'll try it out for another few months when the season starts. And if it doesn't work, then we've kicked the can down the road and we might be able to do a deal, once you become trade eligible in December, January, February. So that's going to be a really fascinating part of this is, what happens with Durant and Giannis and how that impacts not only JK, but so many different players around the league heading into free agency. I just wanted to bring up Andrew Wiggins as part of this because Wiggs was mentioned in a completely different conversation, it must be said, but it's not hard to put two and two together when Slater says that the Heat are a team that potentially would have some interest in Kuminga, right? That's what he said. And then later in the episode, Slater, Kawakami, Thompson, they start having a conversation on, or who would the Warriors most likely reunite with? Would it be KD? Would it be Clay? Would it be Wiggs? And obviously the answer from multiple of those guys was certainly it would be Andrew Wiggins, right? And that makes sense when we put two and two together. Again, they didn't mention, Wiggins as part of that initial, Heat necessarily having interest in Kaminga, part of it that came at the start of the episode, but it certainly was a conversation towards the end from those guys where Kawakami basically said that, hey, the coaching staff certainly would have some interest in flipping Kuminga for Wiggins, and if you could change that, that would probably be a move that no doubt Steve Kerr would probably be on board with. Now, the issue here is, and again, I go back to the last episode where I talked about this in depth, is the problem with Kuminga's outgoing salary only being 50% of what his actual contract is. So, if he gets $30 million from the Miami Heat, as outgoing salary, that only counts as $15 million for the Warriors. And again, as I spoke about previously, that severely limits what the Warriors could potentially get in a sign and trade scenario. And when it comes to Andrew Wiggins, it's not as simple as saying, well, let's just trade Jonathan Kuminga for Andrew Wiggins. Now, on the surface, you might think, well, Andrew Wiggins is making $28.2 million next season. Jonathan Kuminga could get about $30 million. Why can't you just make that swap? Again, CBA rules, the 50% salary thing means that even if Kuminga got 30, that's only 15. That puts you only just over halfway to meeting Andrew Wiggins' salary for next season. Right. And so all of a sudden you'd have to throw in some other significant salaries into the mix. You'd almost definitely have to throw in Moses Moody. Right. That gets you to, around $27 million. So it gets you right there. But let's say it's Kuminga and Moody for Wiggins. Would you do that? Would you do Jonathan Kuminga and Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody for Andrew Wiggins? I'd have some tough times with that. I think I'd almost prefer to keep those two young guys to try it out at the start of next season. And then if that's still a deal that's on the table come mid next season, well, you wouldn't have to give up Moody in that scenario. And this is exactly why there's a chance that the Warriors and Kuminga reunite and wait until December, January, February, where his full salary will count. Because at that point, if Kuminga gets $25 million a year from the Warriors, then by next February before the trade deadline, you could flip Jonathan Kuminga for Andrew Wiggins basically straight up at that point. You just can't do that this offseason. And you can't do that with any guy that's making around $25 to $30 million, as you would be able to come next deadline. So getting Andrew Wiggins back, I actually like the idea of it in theory. I've said it before on this podcast. I think the idea of him as a third guy offensively next to Steph and Jimmy is actually, I don't mind that at all, because he does, he has shown his ability to be able to play off the ball with the Warriors, to be a legitimate catch and shoot threat, which the Warriors need. I think he was poor himself in the playoffs, but essentially Moody took that role from Wiggins once Wiggins left, and Moody was really good at it, but then in the playoffs struggled, right? And Wiggins, as I said, struggled himself in that first round series against the Cleveland Cavaliers. But I think you'd feel a little bit better about the Warriors from a fan's perspective if you're going into a playoff series with Andrew Wiggins over Moses Moody in that kind of 3-and-D spot, right? And then again, he's got still enough juice as an on-ball creator to be able to take some of what Kuminga does as well in terms of that third scoring option. So he's just going to be a much better fit. He's going to be a much better player than Moody, and he's going to be a much better player than Kuminga. So a much better fit than Kuminga. So I can understand why the Warriors, and particularly Steve Kerr and the coaching staff, would have interest in a trade like that. And also from a Miami standpoint, I think that would make some sense for them as well, to try and take the high upside, aspect of Kuminga here, give him significant on-ball opportunity to try and flourish here. I was looking at some numbers yesterday, the numbers when JK plays consistent minutes and plays a big role are pretty compelling, beyond what we just saw in the last 4 games of the playoffs, where he obviously got huge opportunity once Steph went down, averaged over 24 points, nearly 55% shooting. But the numbers when he played, I think it was only 6 games during the regular season in which he played at least 30 minutes, and he averaged over 26 points, over 8 rebounds, 2.5 assists, 50% shooting from the floor. His 3-point shooting numbers go up when he plays more, which makes sense for everyone. The more you're out there, the more consistently you're on the floor, the more faith you feel coming from the head coach and the coaching staff, then you just feel more comfortable. You feel more comfortable, and therefore you can get in a rhythm with your shooting and your overall scoring. So it makes sense that most players' numbers would go up when they play more minutes, but it's certainly a pretty stark contrast for JK. When he does play heavy minutes, he does see a significant role. Those numbers are actually really, really compelling. And it's why a lot of fans would point to this and say, and me included to a degree, I got asked by someone, recently, what do you make of the whole Kaminga situation? And I try and take a balanced view of it. I know there's a lot of you guys in the YouTube comment section that think JK is really talented and this is a Steve Kerr issue. And there's other fans within the organization that think JK just isn't very good, and that, he's a good numbers on a bad team kind of guy, and that he's not ultimately, viable to winning in a way the Warriors obviously want to do, while they've still got Steph, Jimmy, and Draymond together. So I can understand both sides of the argument, and I feel like I've always kind of been in the middle of this. I just have been disappointed with the way the entire thing's been managed. But again, there are valid reasons for both sides of the argument. And if you are pointing to why Kuminga is a real talented player who can be potentially an all-star caliber player in the future, you're looking at those numbers in terms of what he did in the playoffs over the last 4 games and when he plays 30-plus minutes during the regular season. So would you swap Kuminga for Wiggins straight up? Again, I think the Warriors would do it, and I think Miami might do it. But from a fan standpoint, are you willing to give up, the potential of what Jonathan Kuminga could be, when there's still a clunky fit about him and there's still an unknown about him as a 22-year-old young player? We know what Andrew Wiggins is in the Warriors system. We know what Andrew Wiggins is. We know, as I said before, he can be a legitimate catch and shoot off-ball threat. We know when the Warriors need him that he can do a little bit more, but, he's not necessarily suited for that, on-ball role like he was in, Minnesota back in the day, where the inefficiencies were pretty significant and obviously didn't lead to too much winning. But he's a guy, all-star starter in 2022, second best player on a championship team in 2022. Obviously, I think the league has become far more talented since then, and as a result, I think his status as being the second best player on a championship team, he could no longer do that, and that's why at the end of the day, the Warriors said, Wiggs, you're a very valuable player to us, but we need a legitimate second offensive star. That's why they go out and get Jimmy Butler, right? And that's why they make the move. And I think it was a tough one for the franchise to make. I think there was a lot of emotion involved in that and a lot of sadness in seeing Andrew Wiggins go. But that emotion and sadness really dissipated quite quickly when it became pretty clear that, hey, this was the right deal to make. Now, would you bring Andrew Wiggins back? I think there'd be a lot of people within the franchise organization that would have interest in that. Again, unfortunately, you just can't flip Jonathan Kuminga for Andrew Wiggins straight up. It would have to be Kuminga and Moody. And at that point, it's like, are we better off exploring a different situation where you get a different player making that $25-30 million mark? Or would you be better off exploring a situation where, you hold on to Kaminga, you hold on to Moody, and then you see what happens at the start of next season, and then you've still got a little bit of flexibility, so long as Kuminga can retain enough value, which is obviously, again, if you haven't checked out last YouTube podcast, that was my main theme from that, was it was basically, okay, well, if the Warriors do keep Kuminga, they'd have to play him significant minutes to start next season to make sure that his value stays at a point where he would be tradable and teams would have interest in him once he becomes trade eligible in December. So it's super interesting, but I think the biggest takeaway from this podcast, from the Warriors plus minus guys, was that, Miami could have interest in JK, but that it's going to take, it's going to be a wait and see until the Giannis, Kevin Durant stuff plays out. And then in terms of a Miami trade, Wiggs, I think, is the obvious piece, right? But again, it's really difficult with the salary matching in this scenario. So my ultimate thought, I still think that because of the complications around this, because of the numerous problems surrounding this, I still think there's a pretty good chance that Jonathan Kuminga could be back with the Warriors. And some of the alternatives here that I hear in terms of sign and trade scenarios, they're just so underwhelming. Like, there's the suggestions, Kaminga for Vucevic. I'm just not doing that. I'm not doing Nikola Vucevic for a guy as talented as Jonathan Kuminga. He's 34 years old. He's defensive limitations. Is he even going to be part of a Golden State closing five? Probably not. Other names I hear in terms of free agents that you could sign and trade for, Kawakami mentioned in the podcast, Bruce Brown. Do I want to do Kuminga for Bruce Brown? Not really. Like, is Bruce Brown a better fit? Probably, but he doesn't have the scoring talent of a Jonathan Kuminga, and that's what the Warriors need. The Warriors, if they're going to give up Jonathan Kuminga, they need to get some kind of third scoring option back. Andrew Wiggins could be that, fine. I understand that. But these other options like Bruce Brown, no, like DeAnthony Melton was also mentioned by Kawakami. Just bring Melton back on a vet minimum. There's no need to get Kuminga involved in a sign and trade for DeAnthony Melton, I wouldn't have thought. So I don't know. It's just really underwhelming. It's really underwhelming when you take into account that only 50% goes out, and therefore you can really, if you're just trading Kuminga without involving any other assets, that basically is getting you a player that's $15 million or less. And how many guys can you get for that number? I know someone in the YouTube comments after the last episode brought up PJ Washington as an interesting option. He could become available from the Mavericks potentially, depending on what else they do this offseason, depending on if they want to try and get an upgrade in the backcourt and whatnot to try and cover time, I suppose, for before Kyrie returns from his ACL injury. If PJ Washington was available, would you flip Kuminga for PJ Washington? I don't know. I don't think so. Like, again, I just don't think PJ Washington is a difference-making player enough to be willing to give up the talent and potential of Jonathan Kuminga. Like, I still think, and it's amazing because we've been saying this for years in regard to, Kuminga potentially leaving the team, is like, there is a chance that this really bites the Warriors in the backside, where they get a player, that's okay, that's a reasonable fit, but that Jonathan Kuminga goes to a new team and completely starts to dominate and become that all-star caliber player that he envisages for himself. And this is such a much more riskier scenario than when the franchise traded James Wiseman going back to the 2023 mid-season deadline, where they trade him for Gary Payton II, and it's like, well, GP2 is this nice solid role player, but I don't think there was ever any thought of, okay, this could really come back to bite the Warriors on the backside, because at that point we had not seen anything from Wiseman to suggest that he would become a legitimately very, very good NBA player. Like, we just hadn't seen it whatsoever. Like, there'd been flashes in his rookie year maybe, but we just really hadn't seen much. There, at least with Kuminga, is enough signs for supporters of Kuminga to point to and say, here's footage, here is numbers that suggest this guy can be a really, really, really good player in this league for a long time. And that means that there is inherent risk with what the Warriors are doing with him this offseason, if it means that he's going to be departing the franchise, and particularly if it means he's departing in a sign and trade scenario that's bringing you back a player that is okay, right, is fine, but is not necessarily going to change the complexion of your team that much. So we'll wait and see what happens with JK again. I still think there's a chance that he stays, but there's sure to be more to play out over the next few weeks. Things could change pretty dramatically. Obviously, if the Warriors get a deal that they like, then, all of a sudden we're probably going to see Kuminga leave. But is there a deal out there that they like? I don't know. I just think and hopefully Joe Lacob is in a similar standpoint where it's like, okay, I'm happy to let him go, but it's got to be something decent in return. It can't be Nikola Vucevic. It can't be Bruce Brown. Like, seriously, can we get a better level of player than that? Because if we can't, we just keep him. We bring him back on a 4-year, $100 million contract. We work it out, more of a runway at the start of next season to try out lineups with him, Steph, Draymond, Jimmy. Does it work? I don't know. It's certainly clunky, right? It's certainly clunky, but you're at least going to give yourself more opportunity to try that out. And Steve's mentioned it, as opposed to what we've just seen, which was Jimmy arrives at a point where JK's injured. He doesn't come back till March. There's less than a month until the playoffs. And that really, at that point, the Warriors are still fighting for playoff position, have to take every game as if it's their last, essentially, because, again, they're trying to battle for the playoff positioning. And therefore, Steve doesn't have the luxury of being able to afford JK time to come back and reintegrate himself into a new system. He's going to do that now with a training camp and a preseason and early part of the regular season if JK does come back. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think if you're on YouTube. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about a potential Andrew Wiggins reunion, whether you'd be up for that in terms of giving up Kuminga and probably Moody, or if you were happy to wait, would you make that move middle of next season if it was like Kuminga for Wiggins straight up once his salary could fully count? So let me know what you guys think. Let me know. I know Kuminga is a huge topic of conversation for you guys in the comment section. So let me know what you think on the whole scenario right now, and anything else to do with the Warriors off season. Thanks to those of you that are listening via the podcast feed as well. Again, I'll probably be back in the next 36 hours or so for a bit of a finals preview as the Thunder and Pacers gear up for game 1 here. Thank you very much for the ongoing support. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter, and I'll see you on the next episode.